You can't build a manufacturing economy with poor logistics.
In this episode, we talk to a founder of a 30,000 crore rupee company that's powering India's economy, creating jobs, and taking economic opportunity to the last mile of India.
Where do you think India is on the journey?
From about a decade ago to today, I don't think you can recognize a lot of the highways. You can't divide the country into two kinds of people, which is people who live in condos and people who deliver to people who live in condos. That's just not how it works.
What we are obviously generating is kind of unprecedented amount of carbon footprint.
I think there's no question that we will move to EV.
What advice would you give to someone who's starting up?
It's a tough question.
Sahil, thanks a lot for taking the time to come on this show. The objective of this show is for us to speak with people who are working on building companies that end up addressing some of the large challenges that India as a country faces. And what you've done, what you built with Delhivery, a $4 billion company, and the kind of amazing impact that this is having in terms of the infrastructure that is getting built, the role of a catalyst that logistics plays in general for the economy. And I want to touch upon some of those things. But before we get started, it would be wonderful if you could introduce yourself. Give me a brief about your journey, where you grew up, and eventually leading to how did the idea of Delhivery happen?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Background's pretty simple. I grew up in the city of Ahmedabad. My dad was a professor. My mom's a doctor. Was in public health. And fairly standard, went to school in Ahmedabad. I'm a mechanical engineer by training, went to business school. Didn't really know what to do with my life after business school. So I suppose I chose the easiest option, which is to go to management consulting for a couple of years. So I did 2.5 years at a company called Bain started out in the Delhi office and had a great time. We did a lot of work in the telecom sector. Back in the day, this is 2008 to about 2011, when the 3G auctions were happening and there were 8 telecom players in India. And that's sort of where I met 2 of the 5 co-founders of Delhivery. Suraj, Mohit and I used to work together at Bain. And I think we were all at that point where we said we should try and do something else in life. The 2 of them at that point were still evaluating what that something else was going to be. So we all quit Bain at the time, and we were, among other things, thinking of various ideas.
What year was this? Bain?
This is we left Bain 2011.
Okay.
2010. So about October, November is when we left. And then we were toying with these various ideas. Dipinder and Pankaj were with us at Bain. They had gone on to start Foodie Bay, which became Zomato.
Right.
And that was quite inspiring. So we said, look, these guys are doing something on their own. We should think about doing something on our own as well. What was clear to us was that the internet economy was going to be large at that time, because we were part of the 3G auctions. We saw, that data was going to be a big part of the future of telecom. And we said, look, Indians are going to connect to the internet. How do we sort of get in on this action was the broad thought. Spent a bunch of time. We actually started life as a food delivery company in Gurgaon. And we went to Zomato at the time and said, look, you guys do such a great job of aggregating, restaurant menus, getting people to find the right restaurant.
Was not doing food delivery back then.
They weren't. And so we said, we'll do that instead. Did that for about 6 months. And then a whole bunch of e-commerce companies started coming to us and saying, look, if you can deliver food in 30 minutes, why can't you deliver packages for us as well? And we said, well, in theory, we can. And that's sort of the first time we said, look, we need, we were doing it. And then we said, why can't DHL or FedEx or some of these guys do it better than us? And we realized there were certain structural problems with logistics in India. Essentially, let's put it this way. Indian cities are difficult to navigate. That was one. The network models that you have to build, how you get a package to a customer is different in India than it is in the rest of the world. And we said, look, we think we have, a better model, which came from our experience in telecom. We said, look, we design telecom networks. Can we design a logistics network for India? And that's really when the penny dropped and we said, look, there's a big opportunity in logistics. Let's go out and try and build it. So that's really the origin of delivery.
In fact, specific. I just wanted to kind of add here where my previous startup before we started the Better India. Before that, we are e-commerce. We were part of an e-commerce startup which was called Hoopos. We've been baby products.
Baby products, I remember. Yeah.
And that time when we were talking to some of the larger players, and then Delhivery was with new logistics thing on the blog, and we were like, this makes more sense because they understand our language, they understand technology. So I still remember this going way back in 2012 that you guys had started.
You guys were one of our first customers.
Yes.
Absolutely one of our first customers. We weren't very good back then.
But life, happening here. I still remember when I was kind of heading product there, and we were trying to figure like why can't these large guys have good APIs to integrate for e-commerce, right? And then I still remember the conversations with your teams back then. I just wanted to add that you clearly saw the gap there.
Really small world.
Very small world, yeah. And then was curious to know why what the name, how do you come up with the name? Because like if you are thinking of being a pan-India company to kind of restrict it to a city, how did that work out?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. We when we started out, we had no name, so we were just called the delivery company, and
without the H.
Without the H, clearly we're good at certain things, but being creative about names is not one of them. We had no name, and then we realized the delivery company doesn't fit on visiting cards, so we need something better. And we at that time, to be honest, naive as it sounds, we hadn't envisioned a market beyond Delhi when we started out. We said, look, Delhi is a big market, we'll figure out, and if things go well, then we'll think about pan-India. So we said, what's the name that works in Delhi? So delivery stuck, but something strange happened. At that point, we started getting known as Delhivery, and then we said, let's test this in one other city in India. And if it works there and people don't react negatively, this name is probably okay. So we went to Chennai. So interestingly, for most people, Chennai is not the second city you launch after Delhi. You go to Bombay or Bangalore or somewhere. We said, look, if we can make the name Delhivery work in Chennai, it'll work everywhere else in the country. And so we launched. And somehow it got picked up, it got noticed in Chennai. People would stop us on the roads and say, look, you've spelled the name wrong, but at least they would remember it. And so since it caught on, we said, look, it's fine. We'll just go with this. So started off as a silly play on Delhi, and now it's our name for better or worse.
That's interesting, right? Because, like I come across a lot of like now early stage startup founders, and it's incredible to see the amount of effort they would put in getting that domain name right and the name right and the logo right? And in hindsight, if you look at it, it really doesn't seem to play that big a role.
Looks like it, at least. I don't know if we would have been worth, maybe if we were delivery.ai, it'd be worth a lot more.
Yeah, no, because I think that's what we kind of keep looking at and saying, look, how do you first solve for a specific problem, right? If you're solving for a problem, you're creating value, the name and all of that can kind of be anything there. Not to say that the delivery name is not it, but I think
it is what it is.
It generates a lot of curiosity, because now you suddenly and then the whole aspect of logistics is so ingrained in that thing, right? But I've kind of been part of some of the startups where we've had operational aspects too. So like, of course, where you have pure tech, and then you have startups which have like e-commerce has tech and operations involved and so on. And I've always seen that operation heavy businesses are so hard to pull off from the ground level, purely because a lot of the existing infrastructure in Indian cities are not there at the scale at which where you saw where Amazon in the US had you had logistics kind of being nailed, but here D2C e-commerce is starting to take off while logistics infrastructure is kind of also getting built, right? And now, of course, we have come a long way. But what were like the initial, like really hardcore challenges that you had as you started thinking about scaling this?
The challenges in India, you're right. What you've pointed out is exactly correct, which is you're developing a model while sort of the underlying base of logistics is changing. City topographies are changing, infrastructure is changing. More importantly, consumer expectations are changing very, very rapidly. Consumers were asking for same day and next day delivery 8 years ago with, sort of dodgy urban infrastructure, dodgy intercity infrastructure and so on.
And increasing traffic.
we were talking about this earlier, weather patterns changing in unpredictable ways are also problematic, of course. Regulatory environment keeps changing. So this isn't specific to logistics, to be honest. All startups in India face these issues, which is the market's developing so fast and things around you change so fast that keeping ahead is always a little difficult. But if I break it down, the hardest problems for us at that time, the first was building systems which are able to truly understand at that point in time. Now, of course, beyond, but urban topography is hard. Simple reason is addressing in India is very poor. Typically, people think of addressing it pre-2011, even when we were thinking about it, you thought of your address in terms of your PIN code. Now, a PIN code can be any size, right? When you say I'm in Delhi, I'm 11001 or something like that. Your PIN code could be 5 square kilometers. If you're in rural India, it could be 75 square kilometers. In Gurgaon, for example, people only knew 2 PIN codes, but the reality is the city has 18. So that makes it very difficult to find a consumer specifically within an area. But you go to London and you type in, a zip code, you get the exact building. So navigating that in the beginning was hard because essentially our business is about finding people. We move boxes, but we're essentially trying to find you either as a shipper or a consumer and get to your doorstep. That was hard. Building the systems for it took a lot of time, a lot of data, a lot of time to sort of design, execute. And the other part, really, the hardest part, which continues to be tough, of course, is it is at the end of the day, we're a business which is driven by large numbers of people. So finding people, recruiting them, training them, right from the more obvious things around handling packages, not, damaging them, potential theft, pilferage, taking care of someone else's goods. But even really how to think about addressing, how to think about routing, how to think about sortation. At that point in time, this was not very developed in India. So we had to really build this out ourselves. Even finding people was hard. And finding operational manpower, of course, is always hard. But if you go back to 2011, when logistics really wasn't, sort of very sexy overall, even finding people to join delivery was not very easy. So, you couldn't exactly doodle up to somebody and say, do you want to work for a logistics company? Say, no, work for an internet company, a telecom company, a bank, whatever it is. But why would I come work for you? So I think those were the biggest issues we had starting out.
And there was even infrastructure, right? Tech infrastructure. There were no Google Maps, right? Back then. It wasn't as ubiquitous as it is today in 2011. Because I still remember, I think the smartphones were just starting to sort of become more accessible and affordable by 2000, maybe 10, 11.
10, 11, you're right. There was basic mapping infrastructure, and companies like Map My India obviously existed at the time. So it wasn't like nothing was available. But what we realized is we would have to build a lot of the intelligence ourselves. How a logistics company understands addressing is very different from how you use Google Maps.
Okay.
Because on Google Maps, you as the user have an incentive to provide the exact address to which you want to get to. Whereas in logistics, people just go online and say, whatever, I live in XYZ lane, they might leave something out. For instance, the site may have a problem, it might leave something out. The PIN code could be wrong. We've had cases where people give us a Delhi PIN code and a Mumbai address. So you have to figure all of these things out yourself. So the logistics use case is much harder. So you're right, no Google Maps at the time, or sort of ill-developed mapping at the time, ill-developed routing systems. All of that is stuff we had to build.
So, coming kind of to the point that starting from there and where we've come today, that same day delivery expectation has now become 10-minute delivery expectation, right? We've come a long way there. Some for good, some for bad. But before I kind of get into those customer expectations, right? One of the things that I've watched closely is that logistics actually plays a crucial role in the way communities develop and in the way countries develop. Right? Better infrastructure, getting goods shipped faster, which means cheaper prices. You're able to optimize for inventory management better. And the very fact that now consumers, whatever they want, they're able to kind of, get it much faster and much more. Kind of anyone's kind of able to go on the internet and so on. Sahil, I'd love for you to kind of give me some nuance or your view on how logistics as an industry plays a role in the well-being of communities.
At its heart in India, let's start with the the easiest and biggest headline number, India's spend on logistics is widely reported to be somewhere between sort of 13-14% of GDP. When you think about it, logistics in some senses is an added cost to the cost of a product. And so, the objective therefore has to be to minimize logistics costs to the absolute bare minimum that you can. Because if something's worth 100 rupees, but it costs 100 rupees for you to transport, it's probably not worth buying at the end of the day. Now, in India, the interesting thing is it costs 14% of GDP versus economies which are typically in sort of the 5, 6, 7% kind of range. And I think the first economic value that we release, by having larger, better run logistics companies in India is that 7% gap. India is expensive not because logistics is inherently more expensive in India. It's not because fuel is more expensive or because trucks are, more inefficient or people are less productive or anything of the sort. That's part of it. One of the major reasons, of course, is the number of different kind of indirect costs that sit within the logistics chain in India. You go back 12 years and in India, parcel companies never did freight Freight companies never did parcel. Companies that ran full trucks never ran part trucks. Part truck companies didn't do much full truck. Warehousing companies didn't do transportation. Transportation companies didn't do warehousing. And what happens when you have such a fragmented and small market is you end up with a large number of interchanges that add cost over a period of time. The other obvious problem is companies which do well in the north don't service the south, companies in the west don't service the east, and so on. So you really need to have sort of a nationally integrated large player come in, bring scale, provide a wide set of services, cut out all of these intermediary costs.
So is it that the costs are high because the economies of scale are not yet kicked in?
Absolutely.
For most of them?
Absolutely. And you have to go back. The reason wasn't that I think there was a lack of ambition or appetite. Pre-GST, it was hard to build a national scale business in India. With taxation being what it was, the fact of the matter is it made sense to have smaller regional players rather than a large national player. I think with GST coming in, the biggest advantage is that 14% will shrink. So interestingly, I think over the mid and long term, my view on logistics in India is that the market size might actually optically shrink. Because where you're going from 14% of GDP, if you go to 7% of GDP and the GDP doesn't double in that time frame, you have a smaller industry. But what you're doing is releasing economic value for consigners and for consignees, for people who trade. So that's sort of the first obvious value that logistics companies create. All of the other stuff on e-commerce, for example, creating availability, for instance, all of this comes as a secondary benefit. I'll give you an example. Right? Let's say you take plastic products that are shipped out of Rajkot. Now, the obvious direct benefit that delivery creates by existing is suddenly sellers in Rajkot have access to a national market via the large marketplaces or via their own sites or Instagram or however they sell. So yes, we obviously create access, we create availability for consumers. But the reality is if we couldn't get those products to consumers at very low prices, the fact of the matter is that market won't exist at the end of the day. So I think even over the short to medium term, our biggest value is going to come from releasing sort of this economic deadweight loss that's been created due to lack of scale in the economy.
And so the way this gets solved is what? Like you just add more, you increase your fleets, you add more people. Because, like I constantly I hear in some of the circles where I know a few traders who are able to ship products all the way from China, get it here, sell it, and yet make a margin which is comparable to someone, manufacturing in Rajkot and shipping it within India. And so what are we missing there in terms of like being shipped from another country and yet being cheaper? Is it just the scale part?
The logistics part, yes. Of course, the fact that Chinese goods are significantly cheaper than India come from a deeper manufacturing base, which is making things at a significantly larger scale. So when the input price of the product is significantly lower than it is in India.
Which is where the logistics cost as a percentage of the product anyway significantly becomes lesser because the pricing margins are higher or the margins are higher.
The fact, let's say you can make something for $100 in China, which costs $400 to make in India. Now, suddenly, even if logistics is double the cost coming in from China, it's not so much of an issue any longer. So I think they're of course, there's a separate thing, which is can we reduce the cost of inputs?
Sure.
Logistics cost of inputs, and then eventually, bring down overall cost through the supply chain. But I think that's a sort of different problem. The manufacturing problem is an entirely different problem. But let me put it this way. without high quality, low cost, high precision, high speed logistics, converting India into a large manufacturing base is going to be impossible. That won't happen. You can't build a manufacturing economy with poor logistics. So I don't know if it's a chicken and egg problem. India's not had historically a large manufacturing base now. Is that because we've had bad logistics? Not exactly, or subscale logistics, but is it a huge contributing factor? Yes, certainly. So we're enabling that base to grow. Now they have to build scale independently, which is something we can't do.
Of course, yeah. So considering that you have, you have presence in, like, according to your website, it's almost about 18,000, 19,000 pin codes that you've serviced. So you're seeing a lot of this economic activity happening. You're seeing what kind of rate is going around, what products are going on. So do you, like, as you kind of plan this out, your growth, your logistics growth, because this is going to be an enabler for a lot of the businesses that will kind of come up. Are there 3 sectors that you see are going to really kind of grow exponentially over the next decade?
Look, in terms of sectors, from the data that we see, of course, there are some which seem to be growing faster. Consumption-linked sectors obviously have grown faster.
That's your D2C, your
which
e-commerce,
is lifestyle goods, durables, electronics, are all segments which have grown reasonably fast over the last decade or so. And outside of that, I'd say we see a reasonable amount of growth. But again, our data is a little noisy given that we're so small in the overall scheme of things. So when we see growth, it could just be shift towards us rather than something sort of secular. But we see growth, for example, in pharma volumes. We've seen growth in auto volumes in general. But again, I don't know how much of that is a shift from unorganized to delivery
to a formal
versus it actually being, growth in the underlying economy. But I think the bigger shift that we're seeing really is we've seen a fairly secular deepening of the market. By that I mean where a lot of the demand 5 years ago was more concentrated in, let's call it, the top 20 odd cities. We now see sort of a more reasonably democratic split of volumes across the country. That's one. So we can see consumption spiking in places that you wouldn't otherwise have thought, would be as large. So we see, reasonable amount of consumption coming out of tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities. And I don't mean just online demand. Everyone's talking about how, e-commerce has gone to the hinterland, but we see, enough freight demand also coming in from the hinterland. That's one. The second is we see a lot of interesting production centers when we activate logistics a certain way. We started doing agri-commodities about 2 years back, and suddenly we see a reasonable amount of volume coming in, for example, from the Northeast and coming into the rest of the country. So it's interesting. Those kinds of patterns are obviously interesting.
Can you, I understand the whole idea of e-commerce going into tier 2, tier 3. We've seen that, we've seen the likes of Flipkart and Amazon, their reports showing that a lot of that requirement is kind of coming there. But this part is insightful, the fact that there's a lot of freight picking up in tier 2, tier 3. The agri-commodity part can you elaborate a little more on that? Why do you think that's happening? Is there a lot of economic activity now starting to happen? Because otherwise you're always hearing this growth story around Bangalore, Delhi, Bombay, Mumbai.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing, at least that we realized, is that these are people who didn't realize they had access to a national market before this at all. Let's say you do makhana as a good example, right? Now apparently we ship industrial quantities of makhana all over the country. And I just never imagined that this is something we would be doing. And we've spoken to them and said, look, how can this gigantic makhana volume, where is this all going? And I think what happened over a period of time is suddenly they said, look, now we have access to national markets. Some of it, of course, owes itself to e-commerce, to the rise of D2C. And then suddenly these guys who grow makhana are saying, we have buyers all over the country. We have, for instance, we do nuts. We're a pretty large shipper of nuts which come in from a bunch of places. We do fruits from a certain set of places. Now, what's interesting is all of these guys say, look, we never had access to a national market. Now, suddenly we found buyers, whether it's because of online commerce or, on their own. And we never had reliable transportation partners who could actually carry this all over the country. Or maybe there were reliable partners, but as shippers, they didn't trust them. Now, suddenly they're like, okay, we know delivery. You've come and delivered to us. We see that your infrastructure is high quality. Now we feel confident shipping out to the rest of the country. So we are seeing some of these sectors pick up. That said, again, like I've said, some of this is very early with, very, very small volumes growing fast. But they're just interesting sort of, points on how trade is shifting.
Right. At least there are trends going upwards.
There are trends, at least.
Got it. So in that sense, where do you, like, if I were to look at the US, where it started from and again, I go back to the US because it had a very evolved logistics infrastructure. And then of course you have, all the so-called application layer that came in, which is Amazon and eBay and all of these guys. Where do you think India is on the journey in terms of, is it still a very nascent stage? We're just getting started before we get to a point where infrastructure is solved for, it's greatly sorted, and then the application layer kind of kicks in?
I think they'll both happen simultaneously. In fact, I would argue that the application layers in India, whether you think again about various forms of online or offline commerce, are, in my view, significantly more sophisticated than they are across the rest of the world. That's the interesting thing in India, right? Which is demand is really, really forcing people like us, which is in some senses the supply side or the platform side, to keep up with them. We've gone straight in 5 years? We've gone from big box e-commerce to, small box direct to consumer to 10-minute delivery of everything you want, where other economies have taken significantly large amount of time for that to happen. The time between Amazon and 10-minute delivery is 20 years in the US. The time in India is, 4 years or 5 years. So I think the application layer in India is hugely sophisticated because they're looking at global models. Consumers are saying, look, we have an understanding that all of this is available in the rest of the world. We demand similar services from our application layer. And these companies are going out and building it, whether it's, an Instamart or a Blinkit or a Zepto, or obviously the old guys like Flipkart, Amazon, Meesho kind of guys. So the application layer, I think, is sophisticated. On the logistics side, again, it's different in different parts, right? I think our road infrastructure is, compared to even when we started out, I feel old saying this, but from about a decade ago to today, I don't think you can recognize a lot of the highways. We've gone from driving at average speeds of 35 kilometers an hour to easily clocking 55 now in the space of a decade, which in logistics terms is gigantic. You're going from 1.5 day delivery to Bombay to sort of 22-hour trucking timelines, which I think is fantastic. Where India hasn't kept pace and where it's challenging is in city infrastructure, because that's where most of the volatility is. Right? Highways are relatively better. Indian airports are among the best in the world in some ways. Rail infrastructure is solid. Regulatory environment is benign. The challenge is just in-city infrastructure, and that's where I feel like logistics has a long way to go. We still have rapidly changing cityscapes. It's obviously there's a battle between residential, commercial, warehousing kind of land. Becomes difficult to plan and execute a logistics network there. But otherwise, the way I look at it, I think we have 90% of the system form that Indian logistics will have, even 10 years now. I think the base is there.
That's amazing. So you're able to ship from city to city a lot more efficiently now. But once you hit the city,
it becomes harder.
It becomes harder, right? I mean, this is what we see where we
just like driving.
Just you go to road trips, and then the moment you hit back, Bangalore is famous for that. And in that context, I also wanted to kind of address the whole idea that it's very interesting, right? That in a country like India, the whole idea of hyper-local delivery, at 10 minutes, you now have something at your doorstep, kind of evolved. But like, as you rightly pointed out, it didn't really come to that point in a developed economy like the US. What, according to you, kind of has brought about that behavior here? Is it that because we were able to have more sort of infrastructure on logistics, that we were able to kind of deliver on this, or is it just that the demand is so that we already have a critical threshold on the demand, so a model like this made sense?
I think there obviously is an underlying consumer need for things to be delivered as quickly as possible. In India, it's not like rapid delivery has not existed in India. I mean, we were talking about this earlier, right? Like, if you are in Bombay and you just call up your grocer downstairs, he'll deliver to you in 10 minutes. The difference is where maybe 100 items were available to you in 10 minutes. Today, with Blinkit, Instamart, Zepto kind of guys, 5,000 items or 10,000 items are available to you in that same time frame. So is there a need? Yes, I do think there's a consumer need. That said, whether that need expands to, everything in the world, or it's really only 500 items that, really, really matter on a 10-minute basis. I think that's something that, as the real costs of delivering this become more apparent, we'll sort of see, how much of this is really needed in 10 minutes. I mean, do you really need a mixie in 10 minutes? Yeah, maybe in 1%, use cases you might, but you generally need a mixie in 10 minutes, I'm not so sure. And the economic costs of replicating a 10-minute infrastructure are significant. They're not, non-trivial at all. So I'm not sure. I think inventory, which has always existed locally, which is certain kinds of, grocery or FMCG, for instance, does lend itself very well to the 10-minute model. I have a whole bunch of theories on why the 10-minute model makes sense.
I want to kind of get into that in a bit. But I also wanted to kind of just take a step back and kind of talk about the fact that because logistics as a sector is growing like this, and you've seen the infrastructure kind of growing, how well is it kind of translating and addressing the whole issue of jobs and unemployment? Like there's a lot being spoken about the whole gig economy. A lot of people kind of now are able to choose, what kind of a job they do. They can either, sign into any of these delivery service providers, like or food delivery partners, choose when to work, when not to work, and all of that. And do you think this has impacted the job market, and is this the right way? What's your view on the whole gig economy?
So it's a complex answer. There are two parts to this. One is the creation of jobs itself. There's absolutely no question that vast numbers of jobs have been created, right? Delivery itself, we have 70,000 people. Let's say there are 10 logistics companies in India, which are, ballpark our size in some senses. We're saying, call it 500,000 jobs. Between the various, food, grocery delivery companies, I'm going to say they have, 500,000 people employed-ish. So you're talking about 1 million jobs at the bare minimum, which have been created by this industry. To speak nothing of sort of the secondary benefits of logistics companies and food companies. I mean, because Swiggy and Zomato exist, restaurants have been able to employ people and so on. So I'm not counting that, but you're talking about 1 million people or 1 million
Directly
jobs
involved.
that have definitely been created, which is 5 million people when you count households. But that's one part. Now, jobs have been created, no question. The question becomes quality of jobs over a period of time, right? Which is, are people in these jobs over a period of time earning enough to sustain a livelihood? Can you get by earning 15,000 rupees a month in Delhi is a pertinent question to ask, or 18,000 rupees in Delhi.
What is the average earning of a gig
At
worker in Delhi?
delivery in the metro cities, if you're a delivery agent, you'd be somewhere between 24,000 to about 28,000-ish. And then, of course, the scale varies depending on where you are. So metros, tier 1s will be 24, 28,000. You'll be about 20,000-ish, tier 1, tier 2 cities. And then about 18,000-ish as you start getting into sort of semi-urban, rural, tier 3, tier 4 kind of locations. So it's indexed in some senses to the cost of living. So I guess the big question is, how do you create jobs which have enough, value for the person performing them, A. And B, I think a question that remains unresolved is, if you have to work 14 hours a day to earn 25,000 rupees, is that still a job which counts as high quality? Because then the problem is, you may achieve the economic objective without achieving the objective of not having to work 14 hours a day. I think that's a step that the industry hasn't yet sort of fully resolved. We have created jobs, but we have a fairly long distance to go in terms of making sure the jobs are of a quality which ensure that the people performing them can actually continue to sustain themselves in those jobs, either through the wages or through working less hours to earn the same amount of money. That, to my mind, still not resolved.
What are the average sort of hours that a delivery person engages in to make that 24 to 28,000 a month?
The good thing in our neck of the woods, which is if you're doing parcel or freight delivery, is nobody's accepting packages in general before 9 in the morning, and nobody is accepting packages in general after 6 in the evening. So you're it's an 8-hour, 9-hour job irrespective. The problem, of course, when you start getting into food, grocery and so on, is that instant demands can surface at any point in time.
Right.
And so you really have to be, while it's theoretically flexible, in some senses, it's a questionable flexibility. Of course, a bulk of the time is spent during lunch and during dinner. But, you have odd hours. You have to stretch very often. For us, it's usually it'll be about 8 hours a day because you can't deliver outside of that.
Got it. Got it. And so then if I just take the larger picture, not just specific to delivery, but if you look at all these food and these instant e-commerce, right, which has started kind of taking shape. If this is going to be a challenge in terms of the work conditions, the work hours, and these are the workers who are going to be actually spending a lot of time in your city infrastructure, which is extremely hard to navigate through. How do you see this kind of changing? Like, what does it need does it need intervention from the industry, from the government, regulation? Like, what is it that's going to change? Because in my mind, if we say that this is the market deciding that there is a consumption story, there is huge demand, and then there is on the supply side, there are a lot of people wanting to kind of get employed, and here's a platform that kind of enables it to happen, not necessarily with the right set of conditions. But then how do you kind of solve for this, right? Like, who do you think, or how do you think this could be even addressed?
I think the first sort of answer has to come, and the most effective answer is it has to come from the companies that form the space themselves. There is, of course, the heavy hammer of regulation, and if that is to come down, then in any case, it doesn't matter, right? In India announces labor reforms, sure, we all have to comply. But I think the best way for this to be resolved is for companies to also, at least in our case, the way we looked at it, and I think some people in the industry are looking at it this way, saying, do you really want a situation where you're putting workers at risk, you're not providing adequate, either sort of support, adequate economic opportunity, adequate opportunity to even rest and recuperate between, consecutive days of working, for instance. And I think industry players have to take a slightly longer view. The short view, of course, is everybody's economics are pressurized, and so you kind of try and push it down to the bottom. But I think if you take a slightly more evolved view and say, look, these are workers who we would prefer that they stay involved with the company over a long period of time, train them, develop them, build a line through them. It's hard, it's complicated, it's been done around the world, but patience is thinner. I think that's what has to change. First, mindset has to change. The second, of course, is I do think a certain amount of formalization will come from the regulator at some point in time. It's a matter of, in my view, it's a matter of time. It's not a matter of, if it will come. The Indian government has been talking about it. I think at some point we're going to see, material reforms. And I don't mean minimum wage is not the right way to go about it. I think there are a bunch of other things that need to be brought in, benefits on insurance, for instance, provident fund payouts and so on. Number of working hours that somebody can spend on the road, for instance, in a transportation job is something that will probably come up at some point. The question we all have to ask ourselves is ultimately, people who deliver packages and food and grocery are part of the same society as people who consume all of these things. You can't divide the country into two kinds of people, which is people who live in condos and people who deliver to people who live in condos. That's just not how it works. And when you sort of take both of those together, I think that forces companies to say our policies don't make sense. Consumers have to pay a little more for the privilege of delivery. And then when the true sort of economic costs come in, we'll automatically see workers being treated better.
Right. And do you think this will kind of evolve on its own as to, eventually people will figure out which these are good employment opportunities or not?
It'll have to, because the reality is that this is a tough job. And you can't keep working in an environment where you're losing, 100% of your workforce every 6 months or 12 months or whatever. It's too expensive to keep doing that. And I just don't see any other way. At some point, when growth rates tail off a little bit, when you're not growing 50% a year or 100%
when the pressures
a year,
of growth
when the pressures
are
of
removed.
growth are removed, at that point you start saying, hey, look, I need to build a sustainable business. A sustainable business, apart from having sustainable economics, a sustainable market, needs to have a sustainable group of people servicing that market. You need a team that can sustain itself.
Yeah.
So I think we'll get to that point when growth pressures sort of tail off a bit.
Yeah. You mentioned, we were talking before we started recording this, you were talking about the fact that there are sort of initiatives that you've also taken where a large chunk of your deliveries happen in humane working hours. Any other sort of examples that you've thought of or are thinking of implementing in delivery which has impacted sort of the gig worker well-being or the worker well-being?
Different parts of operation, different things. So on the rider side, one obviously is we're fortunate to be in a place where we deliver only during sort of reasonable working hours. But among other things, one is our network model itself. Because our delivery stations are placed very close to where consumers typically are, we tend to have to drive fewer kilometers per delivery that we make. And so one of the things that certainly happens is our riders ride an aggregate lower number of kilometers. So we're able to make sure that people are not spending as much time riding around. Now, of course, in rural India, it's a little harder because distances are larger, densities are lower. But in urban India, for example, the average run that our agents will make will be less than 50 kilometers a day, which is actually lower than a lot of people's commute.
How many deliveries is that? 50 kilometers a day on an average?
Between 50 and 60.
Oh,
in
wow,
general.
okay.
So it's actually not
So on an
as,
average, it's about a kilometer for
is
each
a kilometer
delivery.
or less. In fact, it's less than a kilometer. So most usually about 55 deliveries a day or so. So that's one. You're driving fewer kilometers. You're driving in reasonable working hours is number two. We keep trying to experiment with the shape and design of the bag and, figuring out how to train drivers to do multiple runs rather than doing one big run and so on. It's with some degree of success in different places. The other big area, of course, in our industry is actually upstream from the last mile. We have to load and unload a large number of trucks. That also requires a large amount of labor. There, the answer is very simple. Automation is the answer, right? Huge amounts of material handling systems. So aids for people to not have to, for thousands of people to not have to sort of do backbreaking physical labor to load a truck is sort of the easiest way to make labor both more productive, make it safer overall for them. So fewer crush injuries, fewer sort of general sort of damage. That's what we've been doing overall.
Interesting. And we also keep hearing kind of the idea, like what you mentioned about automation, right? So there is this whole stress in logistics especially, and in general also we're seeing across many industries, the whole idea of bringing in robotics and automation and now AI. And then there's this whole aspect of sustainability, right? Which also, because like you mentioned, right, one is, of course, are you growing a business which is sustainable from a business standpoint? But eventually, as you kind of start growing these large scale businesses, there's also the impact on the environment. And so this whole, so I want to kind of go deeper into each of these, which is, your automation, robotics, and sustainability, and this whole AI buzz that's going on. And I want to kind of go a little deeper in the part about robotics and automation, because it's somewhere a lot of the initial growth of logistics and all these delivery based businesses have been on the backs of people, folks coming and joining and kind of scaling these up. And then when you start thinking about automating a lot of this thing, how do you think about taking the careers more upstream or giving more value to the people who initially started doing a lot of the manual efforts of delivering? How as a business owner, how would you think about it? Like, where do you bring in that, saying that now we will upgrade them in their value of the kind of jobs they get to do? Or is it a hard one?
It's actually not that hard in logistics. Automation takes away the, how should I put it, the most manually difficult and potentially physically damaging parts of the job. That's how we look at it. The second thing, the reason why we automate, so simple things like how do you convey goods across a facility, which is, our Bombay facility, for example, is 16 acres under one roof. Even the physical act of walking around that facility can cause significant fatigue to a worker over the course of 8 hours. You'd be walking well over 15,000-20,000 steps a day now. You do that 6 days a week or 5.5 days a week, 52 weeks a year, that's going to be a problem. So automation, one, helps essentially prevent all of this wasted physical expenditure.
Right.
Now, when that happens, automatically worker productivity starts going up, because the fact of the matter is you're not spending your time walking around, you're spending your time monitoring, which is something you're better at doing than the automation today is able to do.
Right.
So loaders, for example, today can spend more time worrying about the quality of loading of a truck rather than the physical action of sort of carrying goods to the truck. So they can make sure goods are appropriately stacked, fragile goods are in the right place, the truck is fully utilized and so on. Earlier, a large portion of this was, drag item X from point A to point B. So for us, that's one big use. The second is to enable operators to make routine decisions faster. Now, by that I mean, for example, operators don't have to remember how packages are sorted 600 different ways because my sorter can take care of that. Now, when that happens, routine work goes out. But what the operator can certainly do is to monitor how many consignments are going to different parts of the country and then take an intelligent decision on how to route them. So you're kind of moving the person up the chain a little bit. You're saying, don't worry about how a specific box gets sorted to Delhi. Worry about how all of the boxes which are going to go to Delhi are going to go through which truck, what route are they going to take. So it helps operators also level up. Now, they can only level up when you free up their time from all of the other labor that they have to perform. So we think of automation and robotics more as sort of worker aids than anything else. Of course, over a period of time, it reduces the total number of people that we need to have, but it raises the quality of all of the jobs that everybody does.
Yeah. No, I think that's the interesting part that you mentioned, right? You're basically eliminating a lot of the redundant work,
Yes.
which wasn't adding value to anybody anyway.
Yes.
Walking around a warehouse of 16 acres is actually not adding value neither to the person doing it nor to the company. So I think that's an interesting way to kind of think about eliminating that, right? And bringing in automation there. And then while we're talking about automation, there's this whole new buzz about AI, right? Which is like AI is gonna come in and change everything, take away jobs, all of that stuff. How are you guys even thinking about this? Is this even a thing that adds value? Or is it still a sort of a fad thing that a lot of people are making noise about, but it doesn't really kind of impact much?
Machine learning and artificial intelligence are not fads. They're absolutely not fads, right? I mean, the theory on both is decades old. It's not completely new at all. The use cases, though, where we see the largest potential use for machine learning and AI systems, we use a lot of machine learning systems. I'll give you a simple example. You can write your address 5,000 different ways. Turn it around, give us your, give the order of city, locality, apartment, etc. differently to us, leave out some parts, give us the wrong city with the right address, throw in the right pin code. What our ML systems have been able to do is to understand how Indians structure and write addresses. Now, that's a great use case for machine learning and AI in our view. Product descriptions. When you buy something online, there are, relatively speaking, unstructured product descriptions. So being able to identify from the product description what specific kind of good I'm handling, which becomes important because, for example, I can't put aerosols on an aircraft, right? So being able to identify that this is potentially dangerous, this is liquid, this is a large solid, this is expensive, are items that, that's a place where we use ML and AI systems. Another use case for us, which we're experimenting with, for example, is forecasting delivery times. Now, where that becomes interesting is you need to understand how weather parameters, for example, in location X are going to cascade backwards through the network and start affecting delivery. So should I still route through, as an example today, through Delhi North with the farmers' protest as an example? Or if I take a weather event somewhere, it's raining very heavily somewhere, should I still route via the same location? Again, we use a significant amount of machine learning systems which tell us what the best paths are. And we're able to look at the past and say, look, how have things played out in the past? How do we think they'll play out in the future? That's where we see, again, ML and AI systems adding the largest amount of value. I know a lot of talk has happened around how customer service systems are going to be replaced by AI bots and so on. Our view, they're slightly different, which is we have to figure out how to provide better customer service rather than worrying about how to replace the agents that we have. And that's where we use a lot of our ML and AI systems. So not a fad. I certainly think there's a huge amount of value, but it is largely going to be in these technical use cases is what I really see.
Yeah. I mean, with this whole AI bots thing, which of course a lot of customer facing companies seem to be thinking that this is one way to, ramp up your, or reduce your costs and ramp up your margins, and you have bots which are going to answer all questions. Increasingly, I find that even as a customer, I find that like quite annoying because you can just never get to the point, right, with them.
Most of them aren't truly, there's no AI behind a lot of that at all, to be honest. It's rule engines.
Right. Yeah. In fact, most of them are that, right? You just get options. You choose one, then you get three things, and then choose one of those. And it's basically more a binary tree kind of charted out. I want to get to the third point, and I think this is something that at least I've been thinking a lot about as you kind of see the conveniences of delivery commerce, transactions, all of that happening, what we are obviously generating is kind of unprecedented amount of carbon footprint, trash. Like, every time we order from restaurants on any of these food apps, you have tons of plastic and paper waste which is being generated. When that's at least visible, we're not even thinking about the amount of fuel and all of that that's going into getting that food to you. We're paying, of course, for it. Like, there is a convenience fee, there's a delivery fee, and all of that. And I think that's the wrapper, and then we kind of forget, right? Because we don't really see. So, but if this were to scale, like, sustainability becomes an extremely important focus area as we kind of keep growing this. And the sector has to grow, because I think that's how economic activity will be generated. So how would you kind of think, or what are your thoughts on how do you address something like this, as the whole challenge of climate change on one side, and then what we're doing with growth here, and then how do you even bring in the idea of sustainability?
It's a tough question. What's within our control? The two biggest resources that we use from a sustainability standpoint that we need to figure out how to get better at, one is power, and the second is fuel. Fuel being significantly larger than power, of course. On the fuel side, I think there's absolutely no question that I don't even think over a long period of time, I think over a pretty short period of time, we're going to see a pretty large transition away from sort of classic diesel vehicles that we end up using to a combination of electric. Potentially people are experimenting with hydrogen, for instance, as a fuel, cleaner fuels per se. All of the attendant issues around whether electric is truly more carbon neutral than diesel,
Sure, no,
a different
that is
issue altogether. But I think there's no question that we will move to EV. Interestingly, our view is that the biggest change is going to come actually not with just in-city movements. In fact, that's not where the bigger issue is. The bigger issue is the larger trucks that are running on the highways, thousands of kilometers at a time. That's where the biggest opportunity also is to go electric. And that's going to be one big driver of at least reducing our overall carbon footprint. Today, what we do, of course, is by just driving bigger trucks. So the advantage is for the same sort of, if I use a significantly more efficient truck and deliver a significantly larger payload, then my overall sort of emissions per kilo come down quite significantly. So the larger tractors that we use, the larger trailers that we use, those are specifically designed to bring down, our carbon footprint. So that's one way. The second, obviously, is well known. The industry has been doing this for a while, is reusable packaging, at least internally to logistics. So for example, our pallet usage, for instance, our unit loading devices are completely reusable. So it's not like we're actually, You want
to elaborate a little more on that? The loading devices?
Essentially, it's how do I move load? If I want to move a consolidated pallet of freight, which is, let's call it 200 kilos from Delhi to Bombay, earlier we used to use, tons of bags, which again would be polymer bags, and then you'd end up scrapping them after whatever, 2 reuses or 1.5 reuses. Over a period of time, we got better at saying, how do you go from 1.5, 2 reuses to, 10, 15, 20 reuses, which technically is practically sort of, speaking infinite life as far as the bag is concerned. The second, obviously, changing the form factor itself, moving to box type packaging, where we're using, for example, pallets. So we're using our ULDs, which are constructed out of metal, and then essentially using those to move goods rather than using, bags.
What are pallets?
You would have seen those. Pallets are the square sort of plastic or wooden base on which you stack goods.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So when you give it 3-dimensional form, suddenly it becomes much better than using, polymer bags. Now that's reusable packaging, which, for instance, reduces footprint again. Those are two ways you reduce waste, obviously. And then on the power side, all of our large facilities now are equipped to generate solar energy. So we're trying to supply power to ourselves, at least a certain amount of either we supply it back to ourselves or back to the grid where possible. But these are the 3 big areas to reduce footprint. See, logistics at heart, the fact of the matter is we reduce footprint by preventing consumers from going out and sort of spending fuel at the same time. That's essentially, if everybody went out and tried to buy one product at a time, the aggregate carbon footprint would be much larger than somebody doing it at scale. So that's sort of the macro that we operate in, which is the net carbon footprint is probably reduced by having scale logistics companies. But long way to go.
Yeah, but I think that's the angle that you just pointed out. I think that's something a lot of people tend to miss. The fact that instead of each individual consumer going to that mall nearby and buying whatever they're buying, if you're now having that one worker being able to carry all of those products and come to your building or house and delivering it, it's definitely a net plus compared to everybody going there and parking their cars and
That's the positive
congesting
externality
the-
of our carbon footprint, unfortunately. But we will continue to have a large one.
yeah. But yeah, I think as long as the net sort of advantage of reducing congestion and then having this sort of like what you just mentioned, and then bringing in all these alternative fuel opportunities, I think we should be able to do actually make a significant impact on
The other big one,
on
like
this.
is going to be packaging eventually.
Yeah, and as road infrastructure also improves, you will start seeing a lot of efficiency coming in this, right?
You already do intercity.
Intercity,
You
and
certainly
now
do.
with cities
Mileage
coming
has
in.
gone up, for instance. Easiest way to consume less fuel.
Got it. And so it just kind of takes me back to the whole idea. You said 70,000 people working here. I've kind of been part of a few startups and run one now. And one of the challenges always has been like hiring a team, right? And to do that at a scale that you do, I just love to know like what are the like how do you, is there a process to this? What are the qualities you look at? I know, of course, that there are gradations in terms of different roles require, like the most strategic hires would be done very differently than the same. But still at a scale of 70,000, like are there some key learnings on hiring that you could share?
The most strategic hires are the people who deliver goods and load trucks, just to be very, very clear. The
Interesting.
least strategic hires are the people who sit in this office. So our business is run by people who deliver goods and load trucks. Things have changed over 12 years, right? In the beginning, when we also were going through a very, very different cycle in our own sort of evolution as a company, the idea behind recruiting was just find every able-bodied person you can and strap them onto a bike and see if they can work for us. But over time, we've discovered that there are certain markers that do work overall for us. Fundamentally, first and foremost, what has helped us recruit better and people who respond to it are our ideal type, doesn't matter what kind of background they come from, is somebody who's looking for, and I say this with no disrespect whatsoever to any other companies, a job and not a gig. I think that in and of itself is the first indicator that we really look for, because that lets all our other systems sort of kick in, right? Which is you come and work with us, you start off maybe delivering products, you end up becoming a team leader. We now have a senior director in the company who's actually come all the way from the field.
Wow.
So that is part of the value proposition of delivery. It is to tell people you may start off disadvantaged in the sense that you didn't get a college degree perhaps and you started out just delivering products with us. We will figure out how to make sure you rise through the chain and learn skills that otherwise you might not have. And that's the biggest indicator for us usually. There are of course demographic indicators that we look at, which is for instance age. Are you a resident of the location that you're in? Sort of what's your stability in that location? Because rooting our business in local community is hugely important. We can't rely on let's get somebody from UP and put them in Hyderabad and tell them to deliver packages for us over there. It doesn't really work. Those kinds of sort of temporary workforces don't. It makes a lot more sense for us to create a value proposition for somebody. For instance, we're in Goa right now, for somebody who's from Salegaon or from Pillin to actually work at delivery and deliver in Salegaon and Pillin. Chances are he even knows all the customers.
People, yeah.
So those are sort of the indicators that we look for. But as we promote, what we really look for is in logistics is really, really just two things. One, absolutely straight out, is extremely high degree of integrity. And I don't mean integrity in terms of not stealing packages or cash or damaging them or whatever. Professional integrity in logistics for us, very simply, do people come into work on time? When they're at work, if they're unable to deliver something or if there's a problem, are they able to identify what it is and explain it very, very clearly? Those give us the calmest and the coolest operators who we can then train. The second is a high degree of trainability, which we obviously need with 65,000 people. Outside of that, we have our own skill development program. We run a national entrance test. People write the test. We assess them on a variety of parameters. We call them in at our expense for a month of training. When they're done, we start placing them pan-India in various operational roles. So there is a recruiting machine, obviously, that we've built. But at heart, it is the right value proposition. Somebody has to want a job, want to progress overall through the delivery system. And as long as that basic desire is there, I think the system kind of takes care of people.
Got it. And yeah, just continuing on that scale, right, of having so many people kind of working, building a company that's so large. Um, how how do you think about creating time for both physical and mental health, and how does that kind of work out? I in fact I want to have a slightly sort of maybe a controversial question, but like, do you believe in the whole idea of work-life balance? We're hearing so many different kind of views, and people have different views. A lot of people say that
The 70-hour work week.
the 70-hour work week, we've all heard that on the internet. And but like a lot of people, and then you read something like a Paul Graham essay, and you'll say like, hey, what feels like play to you is where you should be working on, and then hence there is no work life. Sort of that question doesn't arise. But eventually, of course, as we kind of build companies, we all know complexities that come in. There are a lot of other challenges that come in. So, is work-life balance as a phrase relevant? Do you think so? And then, if so, how do you kind of address it?
I find it very hard to sort of think of why work-life balance is not a relevant phrase. It's a hugely relevant phrase. The fact of the matter is, delivery is one of the many things that define everybody who works at delivery. The expectation is not that 100% of people's time over here is defined purely by their association with the workplace at all. And I'd be worried if there was somebody who, to be honest, 100% of their attention was for 24 hours a day, 52 weeks a year was just on delivery. I think it's a hugely important thing. We've discovered over time that, but I'll give you straight out, and I've done my share of 90-hour work weeks, and I've realized I'm significantly more effective when I'm not doing 90-hour work weeks, and when there is enough time to do a bunch of other things that help me sort of, compartmentalize, for lack of a better word, get some distance, a little more perspective. So I think it's hugely important. And there's another thing also, right? It's not a question of work-life. The strange thing is, life's also two parts, right? I call it sort of work adjacent, and leisure. Because as an example, driving to work may not count as work, but it is effectively work adjacent, right? I know colleagues who have kids, getting them ready for school in the morning. Is that really life? It's hard to say, because that's not personal time which they're spending on things that they like. That's not them going out for a jog or listening to music or engaging in a hobby. That's actually work adjacent. And so when you add up work and work adjacent, life can become pretty hectic. And as a company, we've discovered that it's not a good idea to necessarily believe that everything that's, there's just work, and everything you're not doing at delivery is essentially life. I think we try to create, and I must be honest, not always very successfully. We have our own growth pressures, and sometimes we succumb to them as well. But we try to make sure, especially through operations, that 8 hours is 8 hours. And 5 days or 5.5 days at most is 5.5 days at most. Which ends up with it being, let's call it a 40 to 44 hour kind of work week. You throw in travel, 2 hours a day. Unfortunately, if you're in Delhi or Bombay or Bangalore, it's 14 hours. So that you're up to 60 hours effectively. And then you do work adjacent, which is another 10, you get your 70-hour work week. For what it's worth, and the rest of it is leisure. But I think it's hugely important. We haven't cracked it yet. How do we do it? Senior leadership has to, discipline begins at the top. And if I'm working 90 hours a week, very hard to drive people down the chain to say, look, you don't need to work 90 hours a week. So that's where it begins.
And on the side, we were discussing earlier as well, you run long distances. In fact, you did the Goa Ironman. You want to spend some time on that? Just tell us, like, how did you start on the fitness journey, or was it always there right from when you were in college?
No, it wasn't. Actually, I used to play a lot when I was a kid. I played badminton competitively. I swam competitively for a while. And then I just lost it when we started delivery. The first 5 or 6 years, I think I also did believe that it was important to work probably 100 hours a week or something like that. It was always sort of, pedal to the floor, running the company. And I think it was at a football match. We had a delivery football team, which unfortunately was not very good. But we used to play these corporate tournaments in Gurgaon, and I remember playing in midfield, and 20 minutes I hadn't touched the ball. And, a partner and I looked at each other and we said, man, we are really, really unfit. We can't keep up with the people we're playing with. And I think we looked at ourselves and we said, look, this is not how, this is not who we want to be. Running a company in some senses is like being a high performance athlete, right? You have to be in the best possible shape, right? You can't be unfit and then saying, okay, I'm going to figure out how to run delivery. So we said, look, this won't work. And I couldn't figure out, because I lived in Gurgaon at the time, I couldn't figure out any other way of getting fit. Running is the easiest thing. You put on your shoes, you wake up in the morning and you hit the road. And so on a lark, I just signed up for the Amritsar half marathon. I'd never run more than a kilometer in my life. And I said, chalo, how bad can it be? And then I rocked up to Amritsar and then realized exactly how bad it can be when you run a half marathon without training. But then it stuck. It stuck because running doesn't need a team. You can run absolutely anywhere in the world you just need your shoes and an alarm clock to wake up in the morning. And then from there it became, I like running, I like cycling, I like swimming. So, and when the triathlon came, I just said, look, let's do all three at the same time.
Yeah, no, amazing. I mean, can relate to the runner's high, of course, like it's one of those things that when you get started and then it's extremely hard to kind of get off.
Yeah, now it's the reverse. Now I think I get pissed off if I'm not running.
Yeah.
Which is...
Yeah, I kind of feel grumpy if I'm not able to get a run in the morning, right? So, I can totally relate to that. Just want to switch tracks. We've been talking a lot about, delivery, logistics, the whole employment thing, all of that. But I just wanted to kind of, because you built what you've built and all the learnings that you've had, this question is particularly for aspiring entrepreneurs, right? What advice would you give to someone who's starting up? And by advice, I don't mean like, any of the cliched thoughts of something, but something that you go back deep inside based on the experience you've had in building what you've done. Any particular advice that you want to give entrepreneurs who are starting to build a company?
Man, my advice isn't worth if I wrote it down, it wouldn't be worth the paper it's printed on, but I'll still give it a shot. I suppose one thing that we've learned is that the laws of business have not fundamentally changed over the last 12 years or so. What is good business is good business. What smells like bad business probably is. Most entrepreneurs do know. When we've made bad decisions in the past, we've put it down to saying at some point in the future, the easiest thing is to say behavior will change, markets will change. But the reality is the underlying sort of economic logic of a business has to be sound. As an example, in logistics, it's very simple. We accepted our fate a long time back saying we can only exist if we are in a relentless pursuit of being the cheapest possible alternative that any of our customers have. Right? Never trying to confuse ourselves saying we're doing anything other than that. We deliver boxes. We deliver millions and millions of boxes. We have to deliver them fast, on time, and cheaply. And that's that. There's no other way to skin this cat, right? You can't go and say this is a value-added service, this is a whatever it is, and so I'll charge more eventually. It's not there. I think very often we can get seduced by, for lack of a better word, shiny objects or delusions of grandeur in between, where you start thinking your business is a lot more than it really is, right? We're in the business of moving boxes. So I guess one thing is just stick to the fundamental laws of business. If the economic logic for your customers is sound, a business can be built. Completely, no advice on execution and so on. That's a different issue and different risk altogether. But I think, especially in the last couple of years, sometimes people have gotten carried away stretching the economic logic of their businesses a little too thin. I think we don't always think through all the way to the end state. I think that's the first and most important. You have to think through the end state of your business's economics, not the intermediate stages and say, I'll figure it out as I go along. You can figure out execution as you go along. You can't figure out strategy as you go along. So I guess that's one. The other, I suppose on a much lighter note, maybe since we also spoke about it, is not taking things very seriously when you're running a business. The number of things that can go wrong by definition is infinitely larger than the number of things that do go well.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're here, right? This is a power backup issue. Anything could happen at any point in time. Sometimes we get so caught up in, we must succeed at all costs every day. And the belief is the graph always goes up and to the right. But it doesn't, as with all other things. So I think it's important to make sure you have enough time, and having either a support system, for me, a support system is running, but a support system could be anything else, right? For anyone. I think it is important. And again, I'm not too engaged with the startup community, to be honest, but a few entrepreneurs who I do know, the younger ones who are starting out, sometimes do struggle with that. That I think that perspective is important for most people who are starting out. The rest of the stuff, I mean, better people than me have spoken about, don't quit, do this, do that, whatever it is. I suspect end state economics, take it easy, laugh a lot is probably good advice.
I think that's great advice, man. Laughing a lot is always a great advice. So on that note, Sahil, thanks a lot, man. Thanks for being a part of this discussion. Very,
Absolutely.
very helpful.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Cool.